Okay, so the next sutta in the program here is called "Born from Those Who Are Dear." I'm going to skip that sutta. So I should have told this before, but I forgot. I'm going to go on to the next one instead, which is the Potalya Sutta, Majjhima 54, Potalya Sutta. So that's the one I will be doing now. And I think the one which is called "Born from Those Who Are Dear" is a fairly simple sutta. So if you are interested, you can read that on your own. I think it's fairly obvious what's going on. If I have time later on, maybe I'll get back to it. But for now, I just want to skip that one. I'm not sure if we have time for all of the suttas, so that's why I'm doing this. And also the Potalya Sutta, it continues, in a sense, the theme that we have been doing. What we're doing is we are working on this idea of how to overcome the defilements of the mind, right? We're looking at how to overcome anger. We're looking at how to use the death contemplation to overcome defilements. And this is a continuation of that. It's all part of this idea of sense restraint, of knowing how to deal with the sensory input and not reacting to it. And the Potalya Sutta is about how to deal with sensuality or sensual pleasures, how to regard the sensuality or even the sensual objects of the world, how to regard these things in such a way as to minimize the defilement of sensual desire. And this is a bit more challenging for people, because now we're kind of dealing into the areas where people normally find a lot of the happiness in their life, right? And once you go into the areas where people find a lot of happiness, that is when people tend to react and not to be so, and not to really understand what is going on. So remember that when we talk about these things, it doesn't mean that you have to react and now you have to throw out all your happiness, right? And kind of start living on bread and water and that sort of thing. That is not the point of this. The point of this is just to give you some ideas of how, from a Buddhist point of view, of these pleasures. And there's something to think about, something to sit at the back of your mind, to have some idea what is going on. You don't actually have to do anything with this apart from reflecting on it. And that reflection will then tend to lead you in one way or another. So this is what this is about, just for being able to reflect about these things. And then see what happens. And of course the point here, the purpose of all this is, from a Buddhist point of view, is to lead you towards something which is much more pleasurable, much more happy than the normal pleasures of the senses. This is the main point with this. Okay, so just take this as we go along, and if you have any questions about these things later on, please, we can take those as usual in the evening time. So this is the Potalya Sutta, MN 54. Have you found that one? It's in here. It's the next sutta on this. You just skip one, and there's one coming after that. Okay, so this is how this sutta goes, and it's termed in terms of a number of similes to explain the limitations, if you like, of sensual pleasures. Okay, so here we go. So this is a household. This is a man called Potalya, and he's wandering around, right? And he's kind of has a cane and is dressed quite nicely. But he thinks that he is an ascetic, right? He has given up the world, given up the household life. And now he comes to the Buddha, and the Buddha have a discussion with the Buddha, and the Buddha says, well, perhaps you're not really an ascetic. This is what makes a real ascetic. This is one of the factors, someone who abandons this desire for sensual pleasures. That's the kind of the background story there. So householder, suppose a dog, overcome by hunger and weakness, was waiting by a butcher's shop. Then a skilled butcher or his apprentice would toss the dog a well-hacked, clean-hacked skeleton of meatless bones smeared with blood. What do you think, householder? Would that dog get rid of his hunger and weakness by gnawing such a well-hacked, clean-hacked skeleton of meatless bones smeared with blood? No, venerable sir. Why is that? Because that was a skeleton of well-hacked, clean-hacked, meatless bones smeared with blood. Eventually, that dog would reap weariness and disappointment. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. sensual pleasures or sensual objects have been compared to a skeleton by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. So the first thing here is to always remember that when we talk about sensual pleasures, there's always two aspects to sensual pleasures. There is the objects of sensual pleasures in the world, all the things that we think about or look at or etc. And then there is the desire inside. And both of those are the two sides of the same coin, the desire and then the objects for which that desire is kind of seeking to acquire, right? So the two sides of the coin. So here you have this idea of this dog, right? Overcome by hunger and weakness. In other words, it's full of craving, right? You're really hungry, you're really weak, you have all this craving here. This is like the human beings. We're kind of wandering around, always craving for things, right? This is the dog. And he goes to the butcher's shop. The butcher shop, this is where all the sensual objects are, right? You go into the dog comes to the window of the butcher shop, so it looks inside her. And it sees all the meat or whatever inside the butcher's shop. But then the butcher is not going to give a good piece of meat to the dog. If the dog is lucky and the butcher cares at all, it will get a well-hacked, clean-hacked skeleton of meatless bones smeared with blood, right? And then the dog gets something, right? Very excited. He starts gnawing on this skeleton, and there is no sustenance, right? There's nothing there. All there is a bit of taste of meat, a bit of taste of blood, and you get kind of the feeling that there's something there, but it doesn't actually satisfy you. And you gnaw on this, and eventually you're not getting anything out of it, so you leave the skeleton aside and you move on. And then you go to the next butcher's shop, right? Because the craving is still there. The craving hasn't been satisfied. You don't feel fulfilled. It doesn't really happen. You go to the next butcher's shop, you get another skeleton of meatless bones, right? The same thing happens again, and again, and again, and again, and there's never any real satisfaction. And this is the problem with sensual pleasures, is that you go around, you go from one pleasure, and then most of the time with sensual pleasure is the chasing after them, right? You're running after these things. The craving is driving us on from one thing to another one. And then when you eventually acquire that object that you desire, you get that relationship that you want, you get that house that you want, you get to have this beautiful meal or whatever it is. And then there is a sense of kind of, okay, you get that fulfilled. And then there's a slight sense of emptiness perhaps, right? Okay, it wasn't such a big deal after all, or you feel a little bit satisfied. And it doesn't take long, and the craving comes back again. Or sometimes the craving is there straight away, but for something else. And on it goes, and it never satisfies. And the problem there is that when you look inside your mind, and you look inside, and see what does the mind tell you? What does the craving actually say? The craving says that if you get this object, you will be happy, you will be satisfied. That's what the craving says, right? But the reality is it never satisfies in the way that it tells you. Craving is like lying to you, saying that this will be happiness, when in fact it isn't happiness in the way that you think it is at all. So then you run along again and again and again, and it never satisfies. And this is the distinction between the worldly kind of happiness of craving, which doesn't satisfy you, and the satisfaction that comes through living, doing spiritual, living, if you like, a spiritual life, for lack of a better word, and doing the things that lead to, living a virtuous life, being generous, being kind, doing meditation practice, making the mind peaceful and calm, all of these kind of things, that leads to a different kind of happiness. There is no craving involved with that one. You sit down, and if you feel, when you feel happy because of the good things that you have done in your life, it's an immediate happiness that is right here and right now. It's got nothing to do with craving. And you will see that as you become more peaceful in meditation, the more peaceful you are, the more happiness you have, the less craving there is, the more beautiful the state is that you have. So the path of, the Buddhist path of practice, it leads to that thing which craving promises you. Craving promises you satisfaction. It doesn't deliver. But the practicing the spiritual path, the Eightfold Path, and all these things we're talking about here, that leads precisely to that satisfaction, to that fulfillment, to the sense of being complete, to the sense of not having any lack inside, which craving promised you in the first place but couldn't deliver. But it comes through the spiritual practice. So this is the distinction here. And the craving is a state of lack, right? It's a sense of feeling incomplete. You need something more to have a sense of completeness. That completeness comes in meditation practice. When you close your eyes and you start to become peaceful and calm down, and you start to feel a sense of joy in meditation, it's as if nothing is lacking anymore, right? And this is the beauty of this. And this is kind of the more you move towards samadhi, we're talking about samadhi in particular here, the more complete and fulfilled you feel in life, the more kind of, there is no need anymore. And that's why craving abates, because the happiness is right here, right now. Craving becomes superfluous, it's irrelevant. So by abandoning craving, in a sense, craving also becomes superfluous. So this is the problem with sensual pleasures, right? It never gives that satisfaction. It never gives the sense of fulfillment. There's always this hole inside of you which needs to be filled up, but which actually, it doesn't actually happen in this way. So, much suffering and much despair, and the danger in them is great, says the Buddha. So, okay, that's the first simile for you. Let's go on to the next one here. Householder, suppose a vulture or heron or hawk seized a piece of meat and flew away. And then other vultures, herons or hawks, pursued it and pecked and clawed it. What do you think, householder, if that vulture, heron or hawk does not quickly let go of that piece of meat, wouldn't it incur death or deadly suffering because of that? Yes, venerable sir. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus, sensual pleasures have been compared to a piece of meat by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and despair, while the danger in them is great. So here is this bird which has a piece of meat, and other birds want the same piece of meat, right? So they go after this first bird and try to kind of rip the piece of meat away from it, and then they kind of fight over this piece of meat. And this is what happens in the human realm, right? We fight over things. We fight over sensual pleasures. We fight over the same partner in life, the same girlfriend and boyfriend. We fight over that promotion in business. We fight over who can be the best, get the best kind of results at university. We fight over, if you're a child, you fight over the piece of cake or the toy that you want to use. When you're going to get your inheritance from your parents, you fight over your inheritance. Who can get those things that they like? We always... the sensual realm is always full of fighting, so maybe not violent always, but certainly in the mental realm, we're fighting over stuff. And this is a problem. There's a limited amount of resources in this world, and the limited resources can never satisfy all the cravings that we have. So because of that, we fight over these things. And I'll read it out as one sutta just after this. I think you should have it there as well. And this the Buddha explains how sensual desire always leads to problems. And this is, I think, is the next one in your on your thing. There's from DN 15, the Great Discourse on Origination. And this is just using this idea of dependent arising to show how craving leads to problems. And so Ananda, feeling conditions craving. Craving conditions seeking, seeking conditions acquisition, right? Craving leads to acquiring stuff. Acquisition conditions decision-making. Decision-making conditions lustful desire conditions attachment. Attachment considers appropriation. Appropriation considers avarice. Avarice considers conditions the guarding of your possessions. Right? If you own stuff, you don't want other people to steal it. You hold on to it. If somebody steals it, you get upset and you hold it back. And because of guarding of possession, there arise the taking up of stick and sword, quarrels, disputes, arguments, strife, abuse, lying, and other bad, unwholesome qualities. And you can see how true that is, right? Once you start to own stuff, once you have stuff which is mine, which doesn't belong to other people, this is mine, I want to hold on to this, then there is always going to be problems in life. So that is the idea of the piece of meat, how we sensual objects, once you become the owner of things, once there is always a price to be paid for that. And sometimes nature comes, right? Nature comes and takes away your belongings. Nature comes and burns down your house. We see this happening here in WA all the time. You know, the fires come raging through. And then you see the front page of the West Australian, and you see the people grieving and being sad and crying, and you see the kind of the skeleton of the house in the background. I've lost everything. Everything is gone. There's nothing left. And people are in despair, right? You can see why. It's quite natural. You're in despair because you lose everything you're attached to, everything you own. This is like this. The piece of meat has been ripped away from you. Your belongings are no longer yours. And this is the reality of our world. You never know how long you will be able to hold on to the stuff you own. Okay, next simile about sensual pleasures. Householder, suppose a man took a blazing grass torch and went against the wind. What do you think, householder? If that man does not quickly let go of that blazing grass torch, wouldn't that blazing grass torch burn his hand or his arms or some other part of his body so that he might incur death or deadly suffering because of that? Yes, venerable sir. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to a grass torch by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. So this idea of a grass torch is useful. You can see at night, right? There's a certain pleasure or a certain advantage with having a grass torch. But very quickly, that grass torch turns against you if you hold it against the wind. And the embers, you get the embers from the grass blowing into your face or your arms or whatever. And this is the problem with the grass torch. And the same thing with sensual pleasures. They provide a little bit of happiness, right? Sometimes maybe even, sometimes a fair amount of happiness, at least for ordinary people. But very quickly it turns into attachment, it turns into problems, it turns into what we just looked at now, arguments and quarrels because you're attached to these things. And the sensual pleasures get ripped away from you, and then you suffer and you grieve. Your partner in life leaves you, you die, and all these kind of things. And not only that, but because of your delusion, you start also on top of that to do stupid things. The more you grieve and the more sad you are because you lose something, the more deluded your mind is, the less clarity you have, and the more likely it is that you will do something stupid, right? It's kind of terrible, but when you suffer, that's also when you do more stupid things often, and then you make bad karma as a result, and you have even more suffering in the future. So, and then there is the craving itself, right? You enjoy some sensual pleasure, and the craving comes, and then that craving is like the dog again before, which always going around gnawing on his bones, not getting anywhere. And that craving is a state of lack right now. It's a suffering right here, right now. Okay, then next one is this next simile is a very kind of strong, to say the least, and it is not easy to get your head around this next one, but anyway, so here we go. Let's see what you think of this one. Householder, suppose there were a charcoal pit deeper than a man's height, full of glowing coals, without flame or smoke. Then a man came who wanted to live and not to die, who wanted pleasure and recoiled from pain. And two strong men seized him by both arms and dragged him towards that charcoal pit. What do you think, householder? Would that man twist his body this way and that? Yes, venerable sir. Why is that? Because that man knows that if he falls into that charcoal pit, he will incur death and deadly suffering because of that. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to a charcoal pit by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Right? This is quite strong. Sensual pleasures, sensual objects are like a charcoal pit. They burn you, right? It's this kind of burning inside. They burn you, and they you end up in a terrible state if you fall into one of these charcoal pits. Without flame and smoke, the idea is that it's a very hot, right? So there's no flames and smoke, it's just pure heat. And if you want pleasure and you recoil from pain, like everybody does, then you twist your body this way and that to get away from the charcoal pit. So this is what the Buddha is saying. If you understand sensual pleasures, you will be twisting your body this way and that to get away from those sensual objects and sensual pleasures, because they burn you. Right? This is what he's saying. It's a very powerful simile. In other words, you would never even occur to you to crave for these things. In fact, the very craving itself is part of the problem. So it is a very strong simile, and it is very hard to relate to. And the reason why it is so hard to relate to is that our outlook, our way of looking at the world is so different from the way that the Buddha looked at the world. And this is what they say in the suttas. They say that what the Aryans say is happiness, the Putujana say is suffering. What the Putujana, the ordinary person, say is happiness. The noble ones, the Aryans, they say that's suffering. And this is what we're seeing here. The Aryans, the Buddha tells you this is suffering, but no, we think it's happiness. So how is it possible to be so distorted? Why is it that our mind is so distorted? And there's a beautiful simile that shows you this. I'll go to one of the suttas again just afterwards. This is the MN 75, the sutta which comes after the one I was reading out before. Tu Magandhya it is called, MN 75. And this gives you some idea how it is possible that our outlook is so distorted. Suppose, Magandhya, there was a leper with sores and blisters on his limbs, being devoured by worms, scratching the scabs of the openings of his wounds with his nails, cauterizing his body over a burning charcoal pit. Cauterizing your body means like you're burning yourself over this burning charcoal pit. Then his friends and companions, his kinsmen and relatives, brought a physician to treat him. The physician would make medicine for him, and by means of that medicine, the man would be cured of his leprosy and would become well and happy, independent, master of himself, able to go where he likes. Then two strong men would seize him by both arms and drag him towards that burning charcoal pit. What do you think, Magandhya? Would that man twist his body this way and that? So exactly the same thing as we were seeing before, right? Yes, Master Gautama, why is that? Because that fire is indeed painful to touch, hot and scorching. What do you think, Magandhya? Is it only now that that fire is painful to touch, hot and scorching? Or previously too, was that fire painful touch and hot and scorching? Master Gautama, that fire is now painful to touch, hot and scorching, and previously too, that fire was painful to touch, hot and scorching. For when that man was a leper with sores and blisters on his limbs, being devoured by worms, scratching the scabs of the opening of his wounds with his nails, his faculties were impaired. Thus, though that fire was actually painful to touch, he acquired a mistaken perception of it as pleasant. So too, Magandhya, in the past, sensual pleasures were painful to touch, hot and scorching. In the future too, sensual pleasures will be painful to touch, hot and scorching. And now at present, sensual pleasures are painful to touch, hot and scorching. But these beings who are not free from lust or craving for the sensual objects, who are devoured by craving for sensual objects, who burn with fever for sensual objects, have faculties that are impaired. Thus, those sensual pleasures are actually painful to touch. They acquire a mistaken perception of them as pleasant. So this is quite strong. Quite strong, right? It's a very powerful way of showing you what it means to be having distorted perceptions of things. It is so distorted that you actually see the world upside down. It's like the leper, right? The leper going to the fire, burning his limbs, And for the leper, there is a certain amount of satisfaction there. But nobody in the right mind, if they were cured, if they were well, would ever go and voluntarily burn your limbs in a fire. And that is what it's like to be free from sensual desire compared to having sensual desire. So this is the idea that sensual pleasures are like a burning charcoal pit. You just can't see it because your faculties are impaired. You are deluded. You cannot see where true happiness is to be found in the world. But I'm sure all of you are starting to see a little bit more of this. As your meditation starts to take off, you can start to see that there is at least a little bit of truth to this. It's very hard to see this fully. We are so immersed in the sensual world, right? Everything we know is the sensual world. We are immersed in seeing things, hearing things, touching things, tasting things. Our whole life is about this. Everything we do almost. And then when you start to meditate, you're finally starting to remove yourself at least a little bit. And you can start to see that you can start to see a little bit of a gap opening up between meditation and the sensual world. Then this gap becomes more and more and more until one day you go to the point where you're completely freed from the five senses and the objects. And then, only then can you understand what it is like to be apart from that world. And then you will understand what the Buddha is talking about here. But ordinarily, we don't know anything else. From the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to bed at night, everything is the sensual world. Everything we do. We are so utterly immersed in this. You cannot possibly see anything clearly. It's that old simile of the tadpole in the water, right? A tadpole has always lived in the water. So you can't understand what water is like because you've always been in it. You have nothing to compare with. You have no distance from the water. But then when the tadpole becomes a frog and it jumps out of the water for the first time, that is when the comparison is possible and you can understand what water is like. And the same thing with us in the sensual world. We're immersed in it all the time. It's all we know and therefore you can't see clearly and you are deluded by these things. Okay, so let us look at the next simile here. Householder, suppose a man dreamt about lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely lakes, and on waking he saw nothing of it. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus, sensual pleasures have been compared to a dream by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. And this is a bit like, we go around in life, we have these dreams about the future, this craving about the future, we think the future is going to turn out one way, we have the dreams about certain pleasures, right? And then eventually, when you get to that point, the pleasure is quite different from what we thought. But I think more generally, it's, when you're young, you have an idea what it's like to grow up, when you become an adult. When you go to university and you study hard, you have this idea of the career you're going to have in the future using your studies. You have this fantasy in your mind what it's like to have a relationship and get married and have a family perhaps. You have this idea about what kind of house you're going to have. And every time you have these ideas, these are like dreams basically, right? These dreams in your mind. The reality is always different, right? The reality is never like that. The dream is always much more beautiful than the reality. You know what kind of career you're going to have. You're going to have this beautiful relationship. The reality is always kind of a letdown compared to the dream. The dream is never really right. And this is the problem in life. And then as we move along, we realize, okay, it's not going to turn out that way. And then we just change our dream and we just substitute a new kind of craving, a new kind of dream, instead of learning that the problem is the dream in the first place. And then we continue craving and we don't actually see that the dream, the craving, was actually the problem. It wasn't true to reality. And this is what life is like. We go through this kind of thing inside our head, what we think it's going to be, and it never actually turns out that way. This is what craving does. Craving leads to this illusory reality in our minds, which never is actually experienced in the real world. That's a simile of the dream. And to underscore that one, there's another nice little sutta which I have put in there for you. This is called, it's the one which comes after the one I just read out before. This is the sutta to a monk called Samidhi, SN1 colon 20, you have it there, to Samidhi Sutta. And this is how this short little sutta goes. Thus have I heard, on one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajagaha, the hot springs park. Then the Venerable Samidhi, having risen at the first flush of dawn, went to the hot springs to bathe. Having bathed in the hot springs and come back out, he stood in one robe drying his limbs. Then, when the night had advanced, a certain devata, beings in higher realms of stunning beauty, illuminating the entire hot springs, approached the Venerable Samidhi. Having approached, she stood in the air and addressed the Venerable Samidhi in verse. Without having enjoyed, you seek alms, bhikkhu. You don't seek alms after you've enjoyed. First enjoy, bhikkhu, then seek alms. Don't let the time pass you by. I do not know what the time might be. The time is hidden and cannot be seen. Hence, without enjoying, I seek alms. Don't let the time pass me by. Then that devata alighted on the earth and said to the Venerable Samidhi, you have gone forth while young, bhikkhu, a lad with black hair, endowed with the blessing of youth in the prime of life, without having dallied with sensual pleasures. Enjoy human sensual pleasures, bhikkhu. Do not abandon what is directly visible in order to pursue what takes time. I have not abandoned what is directly visible, friend, in order to pursue what takes time. I have abandoned what takes time in order to pursue what is directly visible. For the Blessed One, friend, has stated that sensual pleasures are time-consuming, full of suffering, full of despair, and the danger in them is still greater. While the Dhamma, the teachings of the Buddha, this practice is directly visible, immediate, inviting one to come and see, applicable to be personally experienced by the wise. And this is an interesting little sutta because it shows you, I think, a very kind of common idea in the world. And this is the idea that sensual pleasures, they're right here, right? You can have them straight away. Why go off and kind of meditate? And why go off on this spiritual path which kind of leads into the future and you don't know where you're going to go? It takes, take a long time to get these results on the spiritual path, a long time to actually get to Nibbana, right? It all takes so much time, but happiness is right here. This is kind of the usual view of the world. And this is what this Deva is saying to this monk. It's like the tempter coming down and trying to tempt him back into the ordinary world. But actually, from the point of the view of the Buddhist teachings, it's the exact opposite. It is not the sensual pleasures are what take time, right? You're always thinking about the future, always craving, always dreaming about these things. These are the things which are never immediately available. You're always living in this space of desire and craving, and is always looking to the future. Something in the future is going to become right. So that is the craving. It's the sensual pleasures would actually take time, which is time-consuming. Whereas the Dhamma, if you sit down and you abandon that desire for sensual pleasures, straight away you start to feel the happiness of that. Straight away you get some result in your meditation practice. By practicing kindness and goodness in the present moment, straight away you feel the happiness of that kindness and goodness right here, right now. And it has nothing to do with craving anymore. When you're kind, you are just kind, and you feel happy as a consequence. There's no craving involved in that. There's no time involved with that. It is immediate. It happens here and now. So this is the thing. It is that it is actually the opposite, and this is quite an eye-opener, right? It is not the Dhamma. It's not about time, and this is what we say in meditation practice as well. Don't think about where you want to get. Enjoy what you have now. This is the same thing. Try to get away from that craving, the desire for the future, and just enjoy the present moment. The Dhamma is not supposed to have anything to do with time. The Dhamma is about the here and now, straight away. So that is the Venerable Samidhi, and his little experience with a deva coming down and sort of trying to lure him back to sensual pleasures. Not perhaps luring him back, more like she probably thought that was the reality, right? The sensual pleasures really are where happiness is to be found, and so she's just probably telling the truth from her point of view. Okay, so that is the sensual pleasures being like a dream. So then we can move on to the next one. Householder, suppose a man borrowed goods on loan, a fancy carriage and fine jeweled earrings, and preceded and surrounded by those borrowed goods, he went to the marketplace. Then people seeing him would say, "Sirs, that is a rich man. That is how the rich enjoy their wealth." Then the owners, whenever they saw him, would take back their things. What do you think, householder? Would that be enough for that man to be dejected? Yes, Venerable Sir. Why is that? Because the owners took back their things. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to borrowed goods by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Sensual objects, the objects of the world, everything we own in the world, all the stuff we have, it is like borrowed goods, right? You go through life and sometimes you lose things, they just disappear, the things you own disappear. The bushfire burns down your house, the burglars burgle your possession, the government takes the money in tax, right? And your things get taken away from you in this way, and you can't avoid it, or something gets just damaged in one way or another. This always happens during life. But all of that is still not so certain. But what is absolutely certain is that when you die, everything you own in this world, you're going to have to give it up. Absolutely everything, every last thing you own. Right? What does that mean, that you have to give everything up? It means that everything you own in this life, you don't really own it after all, because you can't control it. Everything you have is borrowed goods, right? You borrow it during this life while you're here, and then when you die, you have to give it all up again. It's a very powerful way of looking at life and death, that everything you have is borrowed, and it has to be given up again. And then you start reflecting to yourself, well, if everything I own in this world is borrowed, then how much do I want to invest in this borrowed stuff? It's like you're renting a house, right, or renting a car. Now, if you're renting a house and you're going to stay there only for a short time, how much effort, how much energy are you going to put into doing up that house and painting it and fixing it up and doing all kinds of things? There's a limit to how much you're going to do to something which you are borrowing. If you're borrowing something, maybe you'll do a little bit, but you won't be doing that much. So remember that. If things are borrowed, how much effort are you willing to put into the borrowed goods of the world? Right? And things suddenly start to change. You get a different perspective. Actually, where you would like to put in your effort is in the places where things are not borrowed. So what are the things that are not borrowed in this world? And the things that are not borrowed are the things that you can take with you, right, into the future. And this is the idea of the Buddhist path, that all the spiritual qualities that we build up in this life, the personality that we create, the mind, the beautiful mind that we build up in this life, that is the mind that you also take with you into a future existence, into wherever you go in the future. And this is why this idea of rebirth is so central to the whole Buddhist outlook, the Buddhist worldview, because it suddenly enlarges your entire way of looking at things. Suddenly, this life, everything in this life becomes so what? It's not so important anymore. Yes, you do enough to make sure you have a good life, to make sure that you don't suffer too much, etc. But you don't invest an enormous amount of time in something which is so transitory, something which disappears so quickly, something which is just borrowed for the time being. And you start looking at the big picture and you say, well, what really matters? And And that is the mind state that you create in this life. It makes you happy in this life, and it also is something you can take with you into the future. And I find this a very beautiful and powerful simile, personally, the idea of borrowed goods. You can't take it with you. You have to leave it all behind. If not, sometimes long before you die, but certainly when you die, you're going to have to leave it all behind. Okay, let's have a look at the last simile here. So, householder, suppose there were a dense grove not far from some village or town, within which there was a tree laden with fruit, but none of its fruit had fallen to the ground. Then a man came needing fruit, seeking fruit, wandering in search of fruit, and he entered the grove and saw the tree laden with fruit. Thereupon he thought, this tree is laden with fruit, but none of its fruit has fallen to the ground. I know how to climb a tree, so let me climb this tree, eat as much fruit as I want, and fill my bag. And he did so. Then a second man came needing fruit, seeking fruit, wandering in search of fruit, and taking a sharp axe, he too entered the grove and saw the tree laden with fruit. Thereupon he thought, this tree is laden with fruit, but none of its fruit has fallen to the ground. I do not know how to climb a tree, so let me cut this tree down at its root, eat as much fruit as I want, and fill my bag. And he did so. What do you think, householder, if that first man who had climbed the tree doesn't come down quickly? When the tree falls, would he break his hand, his foot, or some other part of his body, so that he might incur death and deadly suffering because of that? Yes, venerable sir. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to fruits on a tree by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. So, here you have this idea of this dense grove, right? A dense kind of forest. It's like a jungle. You walk into this dense grove, this jungle, and you have trees and things everywhere around you. And this is like the sensual world I was talking about before. We're wandering around in the world and we're seeing things, we're hearing things. We're in this jungle all the time, right? We can't really see very far because we are hindered by all the stuff around us everywhere. This is always, we're always in this jungle of sensual pleasures. And I don't know if you remember the simile in Ajahn Brahm's book. It's a very nice simile. It fits very well with this. And this is the simile where Ajahn Brahm talks about his experience in Central America, in Guatemala, where they have these pyramids, the Mayan pyramids and all these things. And he said Guatemala is very close to the equator, right? It's very warm, it's a tropical country, and the jungle is very thick. And he explains how he was traveling through the jungle. You can only see a few meters in front of you because everything is so dense. And then you come to the pyramid, right? You get on the pyramid and you walk up on the pyramid, and for the first time you are above the canopy of the jungle, and you can see what is going on. You can understand. You get the context. You can see maybe the ocean in the distance, and you can see the extent of the jungle, and you can maybe see even the rivers and things kind of winding the way through the jungle. You get a perspective on things. And he says that this is exactly like in meditation practice. When you meditate, we're engulfed in the jungle of sensual pleasures. But one day when meditation starts to work, for the first time, it's like you elevate yourself above that jungle, and for the first time you get perspective and you can see what is going on. And this is what we're seeing here, this people coming from the village. And maybe the village here is a designation for samadhi, I'm not sure. And you enter this jungle, right? And you're running around in this jungle, seeing all these trees, looking at all the objects of sensual pleasures, looking for the fruit, looking for whatever it is. The fruit here is just a sign that you find a nice sensual pleasure in this jungle. And then you try to get hold of it, right? And actually that simile of which Ajahn Brahm talks about climbing the pyramid is actually very similar to a simile in the suttas, where the Buddha talks about climbing the mountain, and then suddenly at the top of the mountain you look out and you get perspective for the first time. So actually it is the same one. Probably it might be that's where perhaps Ajahn Brahmali got it from in the first place. Anyway, so you're running around in this jungle and you find, looking for happiness and essential pleasure, and you find this nice fruit tree, right? So you climb the fruit tree to kind of gorge yourself on the fruit, to kind of really enjoy the essential pleasures. And then when you get up there and while you are kind of eating your fill, what happens when you are kind of doing that? What happens? You become heedless. You don't know what's going on anymore. You become intoxicated with all the enjoyment, right? That's what's happening here. And this is what is happening in ordinary life. We become intoxicated with the enjoyment of the sensual pleasures. We forget what is actually going on. And in the meantime, another man comes and he starts cutting down the tree at the root, right? And if you stay intoxicated, if you stay completely deluded by those sensual pleasures, you won't even notice that man at the bottom. And then eventually the tree fall crashing down, and then you will have to reap the consequences. And this is like the intoxication in ordinary life. We are intoxicated by sensual pleasure. You forget what is important. We forget to be heedful. We forget to be careful in life. And when you forget all those things, because you're intoxicated, you do stupid things in life. You're intoxicated by sensual pleasure. You end up doing all kind of crazy things which you wouldn't be doing if you had clarity of mind. So this is what is going on here, and this is how I understand this simile of the tree laden with fruit. And then you have to incur the suffering that comes as a consequence of that in the future. So, there you are. So those are some of the similes of the Buddha when he talks about sensual pleasures. And again, just to remind you, the purpose of this is not now for you to think, oh, I have to throw out all the sensual pleasures. I must not even consider these things anymore. That is the wrong way. That's just being like intellectualizing, right? Or thinking that you have understood, or doing things not because it feels right, but just doing things because you have some kind of superficial confidence or faith or whatever. That is the wrong way of going about these things. This is the sort of stuff that you have to think about, and then you have to allow it to sink in and to see for yourself if there is some truth to this. Compare your experience in meditation, look at that compared to your experience in ordinary life, and then see what happens. And if you find that there is some truth in these things, then you will automatically move in that direction, and it will happen all by itself. And that is the ideal way of making progress on this path. By understanding gradually, slowly, and this happens as a matter of course, then that is the right way of dealing with these things, and not just kind of trying to throw it all out using willpower or using a superficial sense of confidence in these teachings. So that is the way, but I'm sure that you can already see that there is obviously some truth to this, right? It's hard perhaps to know exactly how deep that truth goes, but these similes are not, at least to some extent, they are understandable. We can relate to these things, although to relate to them fully is actually quite difficult. Okay, so I think that is probably enough for this morning. So that is the central